Welcome to our first Philosophy Out West event for 2019. I'm excited to have Peter Lupu here from Glendale Community College. And my name is Owen Anderson. I'm a professor of philosophy and religious studies here at ASU. Our Philosophy Out West events are meant to be public events that help highlight what we do in philosophy and give everyone a chance to get engaged and involved in philosophical discussions. It was at an event not unlike this one that first sparked my interest in philosophy. There was something that captivated me about seeing people discuss the most important questions that we can ask. There were deep disagreements in the discussion, but what I saw was set in a context of having a rational dialogue about these important questions. So I call these the basic questions. We'll be talking about those today. They're basic in the sense that they underlie everything else we think and do. And yet we don't get to talk about them very often. And when we do talk about them, we're often dismissed as this just being a matter of opinion or our personal preference, but we don't actually get to having knowledge, let alone solving disputes and disagreements. So what fascinated me when I saw this discussion was people being able to talk about these questions and also offering proof about how we can have knowledge and about answering these basic questions. So ever since that time, I wanted to continue studying these and pursuing this kind of activity. I don't know if there's anything more meaningful than being able to talk about and discuss these kinds of questions and how they impact our lives at every level. I think you'll see a number of them come up today, and what we'll look at is how pretty well any disagreement that we're talking about comes back to some of these philosophical issues. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been hearing about how there's not much value in philosophy, or that there's not much value in having civil discourse. I don't know if you go on Facebook, that's on the internet now, and people argue and disagree about things, and they don't really make any progress, do they? And so it becomes discouraging. There's not much reason to have talks or disputes with people we disagree with. It's dismissed as, maybe it's kind of a hobby. If it's your hobby, that's fine, but it's not actually going to produce anything lasting or beneficial. And a philosophy degree doesn't really get you much. It's certainly not access to a high-paying job. Right? Philosophers generally have a reputation of being do-nothing layabouts. That fit the philosophers you know? Philosophy and philosophers in general may have brought this reputation on themselves. I'm willing to consider that, especially because philosophy is interested in asking basic questions and coming to have knowledge in order to provide our lives with meaning and the challenges that face us. And so if philosophy fails to do that, it doesn't have much value. It'll be tossed out. It might be somewhat interesting, but I asked a student this earlier who said that philosophy is valuable, and I said, would you pay $10 to come see the talk today? No, right? Would you pay $10, or have you paid yet, by the way? It does cost $10.
I paid $9 for parking, does that count?
That's right, yeah. That's not a small thing either, that you have to pay for parking. That does show some commitment. But in general, people aren't rushing to pay to watch philosophical discussions. So what's the value of philosophy, and civil discourse especially? Does it get us anywhere? So what Peter and I want to do today is discuss some of these basic questions together as a kind of example in order to see how this can be done. So we have some things we disagree on and some things we agree on, but I think in general what we want to do is be an example of philosophical discourse, civil discourse. And sometimes we see a lack of this civil discourse in our philosophy or in our communities. And I think it's especially philosophers who are equipped to teach and be examples about how to do civil discourse. This means more, civil discourse means more than merely being polite. That's a start, learning even how to talk with someone you disagree with without losing your temper. But it means more than that. It means having a rational dialogue. So rational dialogue has certain necessary preconditions. Not all dialogue is rational dialogue. In fact, most of what you witness might be non-rational, irrational dialogue. And sometimes this just becomes simply foolish arguments. And in my case, I have so little time left in my old age that I want to avoid foolish arguments. It's not good for me, wasting time, but it's also not good for people watching them. to be encouraged into that kind of thing. So we want to learn how can we avoid foolish arguments and have rational dialogue. So we're going to give an example of how we can have civil dialogue as rational dialogue. And I'm going to start with a number of questions with Peter, and I'm sure each of them will have follow-up questions, and this will turn into a dialogue, which means we don't exactly know where it'll go. It's not really pre-planned at all. It'll have a life of its own, and that's part of the wonder and enjoyment of seeing how these things unfold. So let me just set a quick context of what philosophy does. Philosophy asks certain basic questions, which we'll probably see come up today. For example, how do I know? What is knowledge? What is real? And what is good? So we'll be going over these today, and before we come to these, I want to figure this out about civil dialogue. This is in a way a continuation from the fall event, God and Truth. We talked there a little bit about the idea of common ground. And I wonder, do we have, I mean in general, not just Peter and I, but do we have any basis for common ground? And especially, in what way is reason or rationality a precondition for doing civil discourse? Can we expect to make progress in civil discourse apart from having reason as common ground? So I want to get Peter's views on that. And it might be awkward since we have to like in a normal conversation about passing microphone, but this is meant to be kind of conversational.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Everybody there in the back? Everywhere? Good. So first, I guess we need to figure out what we mean by common ground. What would count common ground? If we were to have common ground, how would you recognize that? And secondly, I think that if we proceed in a philosophical inquiry by reflection, we will find common ground. But I believe that common ground need not be staying the same throughout the whole conversation. It itself may be subject to reflection and philosophical examination, and it might change as we go on.
Yeah. Same thing. Can you hear me without that?
Yeah.
Loud enough? All right. So what about like something like this? I mean, in philosophy, we're going to use certain laws like the law of non-contradiction. How much time would you spend getting into a discussion if someone said up front, I'm not going to hold the law of non-contradiction? And I don't mean I'm doing something like paraconsistent logic. I mean, even if I contradict myself, that doesn't matter.
I would not give up immediately if I think that they are sort of playing with me,
Yeah.
then I wouldn't continue the discussion, even if they would say, oh, I would never, ever accept a contradiction.
Yeah.
So it matters whether I
Yeah, so the
perceive
intention.
the intention. But if I think their intention is like, well, look, who would claim they don't have contradictions in their system of beliefs? So they say, so maybe we should accept it as a way of life that we have contradictions. I would then engage with them.
Well, that's a little different. In other words, saying no one's perfect.
Right.
But when we're entering into a conversation and we say I probably have contradictions somewhere, the idea is once I find them, I'll sort them out. Not that I'm going to
Right.
keep them. So what I'm wondering about is rationality as a necessary condition for dialogue. This is not someone like that. This is someone saying, my words don't even mean what they mean. That's how bad it gets sometimes.
Yes, and if it gets, if we do that game, then I will tell them that, they just predicted that, what's the baseball team? That the Diamondbacks will win the World Series next year.
Yeah. It's almost
and
as bad
they would
as
say,
that.
and they would tell me, no, I didn't mean that. And you say, okay, fine. By the way, this is a joke by Sidney Morgan against Derrida.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Derrida came to talk in Columbia University. Sidney Morgan was a professor of mine from Columbia, and Derrida came to give a talk whereby Derrida proclaimed that there are no objective facts about text, it's all interpretation. And Sidney raised his hand and said, so you just predicted that the Yankees will win the World Series? And then I said, what?
Yeah.
And then Sidney said, well, you know, the Yankees are a baseball game and
Yeah.
team and all that. And Sidney said, no, I didn't mean that. I said, really?
Yeah. So that's where there's a level of, say, identity, the law of identity. When we're speaking about, in this case, Derrida saying it's all a matter of interpretation, he means it's all a matter of interpretation, and he doesn't mean it's not all a matter of interpretation, the Yankees are going to win.
Right.
So we'll call this radical skepticism, where someone says, I don't even think A is A. At that point, I don't see whether it be what I'm calling common ground. What I mean by common ground is not merely something we find in common, like it turns out you and I both like Jerome. Mm-hmm. And we think we have that in common. That's personal common ground, but that's not the same as common ground for all thinkers about any problem.
Right.
So that's what I'm wondering. And also, it's not arbitrary. Like we could all agree, the Diamondbacks won't win. It's kind of an arbitrary thing. This is something that is necessary, a precondition for rational dialogue.
And I agree to the extent that it's a precondition to start. And sometimes actually, I think we have common ground, we agree on a common ground, and we begin the inquiry and we go from there. And then we sometimes encounter a situation in which maybe we alter what we actually agreed on, on the meaning.
Well, it could, but that's what I'm wondering. Could it alter that A is A? Like, is that open to say, oh, it turns out what I'm saying right now isn't what I'm saying, and it's not really alterable, but it also is?
So I think that we have to agree on that for a long distance. And the long distance reaches more or less up to that point right there, where Eric Updike is sitting. Because then Eric Updike would teach us that there have actually now logical systems without identity.
Good. So yeah, a logical system is different than reason. So a logical system is a system of the rules for inference. So it's perfectly possible you could have a system of inference where when you have A, the rules state you can't infer A. Or you can have A and non-A as a legitimate premise. That's possible, and in that way it's almost why some like Derrida might call it a logic game. You're stipulating certain rules ahead of time. And we're not really talking about that. We're talking about even in such a system.
In a broad sense.
Paraconsistent logic is paraconsistent logic. It's not non-paraconsistent logic. It is what it is.
Yeah.
So we're talking about prior to thought.
Yeah, and I agree. In this broader sense of reason, I agree that we have to have some common ground on some basic fundamental principles and on meaning.
Yeah.
Joe. Another mathematician from GCC.
Good, thank you for being here.
So let's agree on that.
So yeah, we agree on that. Well, it's interesting because someone could say, I've been in conversation before, they'll say, we'll agree on that practically. Like pragmatically, we have to go about doing this. And that alters the discussion a little bit because then, that's why I'm using the phrase rational dialogue as opposed to pragmatic or practical dialogue. So then we're really talking about an idea of what works. Mm-hmm. And American philosophy has especially been identified with pragmatism.
Yeah.
And those American philosophers haven't done very well sorting out their disputes. So what works for William James may not be what works for Alvin Plantinga. Mm-hmm. And we haven't gone very far. So I want to distinguish between pragmatism on the one hand and rationality as a precondition for talking about that. It's not simply because it works. When we speak about what works, we're importing a lot of ideas about what it is we're trying to do. Right?
Yeah, and I'm not saying it in a pragmatic sense that, let's just establish something that works for now and then go on. I think that we'll perhaps find out later on what sort of my current attitude is. But I agree that in principle, if reason has certain fundamental principles that eventually we have to agree on, or even to start with, we have to agree on and then go on from there.
Well, and I wonder too, because this is what you say, for the long ways out, we can see, it seems like we'll go with identity. I'm wanting to suggest also that it's not just a law of thought, it's a law of being. So when we talk about, if we approach it empirically, we might say, in all of my experience and every other human who's written, A is A. But for all I know, when I get to the dark side of Pluto, I'll find an A that's a non-A. So that's approaching empirically. as opposed to approaching it as a precondition for thought and being. Because thought and being really aren't absolutely distinct. Thinking is an activity of a being. Right? So when we speak of being, we're speaking of being is being, not being is non-being. And so reason is not simply a kind of thing we do in the abstract, but it's tied to what is real also. And that's how we get that. That's why we're able to go from epistemology to metaphysics.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me think about that.
Fine. That's good. That's what we're supposed to do here. Because this, again, we set this up as a discussion to be done in front of you. It's not a debate where we're saying this is true, now this is true, and going back and forth. So it's perfectly reasonable in any discussion to say, I don't know. Let me think more about that. And that's part of what we want to model when we're doing this. But how about this one? Here's another one I've encountered. And I brought this up, and I'm going through some points we taught about in God and Truth. Mm-hmm. But I've encountered both persons who say reason as a law of thought isn't necessary for dialogue. And I'd be willing to grant that. Not necessary for dialogue. It is necessary for rational dialogue. Those can be different. Mm-hmm. And I think what breaks people down is they see so much dialogue happening that's not rational dialogue. They just see emoting or venting, and nowhere makes any progress, and that can be discouraging. Mm-hmm. So what I also see, though, is that people treat it as a kind of intellectual game. I would say it this way: they don't have integrity in the following sense. They're not being consistent. They'll want to discuss things, but they don't actually apply it to how they live in their life. Mm-hmm. And I think an agreement in the discussion of having integrity is necessary as well ahead of time. And what we're talking about is not merely a game, but this actually applies to how I live.
Mm-hmm. So let me say a few things about the last part, and then go back to the first part that I said I would think about. The last part is, if you have sincere philosophical debate and discussion, or just thinking, I believe you always gain. And the gain is not necessarily because you end up with some answer or a product. Very frequently the gain is simply because you have reflected on some serious questions, and sometimes you end up with perhaps not a decisive answer, but you have made progress by ruling out things and so forth. So we should not judge progress in the same way we judge progress in some other areas, for car building and stuff like that.
I think that's right, and especially that's what I mentioned is observing this process that goes on.
Yeah.
So what we do in humanities, I'll speak more broadly than just philosophy, but the humanities in general, we might read a great book and discuss it, and it's not necessarily a goal of getting some product at the end of it, but it's that process of going through
growing,
interacting with art, whether it's literature or painting or music. So, and philosophy counts as well. So as students come into college or university, they probably haven't done this before. And so just by observing this, going through this in Philosophy 101, mm-hmm. it's expanding their awareness of the kinds of questions that we can ask and think about.
And it's very dangerous for a society to get stuck in the sort of like instrumental reasoning or instrumental assessment alone.
That's the pragmatism I was mentioning.
Yeah, and it's like if you assess everything in terms of what kind of tangible results you get, that affects your whole way, the society's way of thinking, approach, values, and the consequences could be extremely harmful.
Well, I wonder about this way. In other words, what the humanities study is the human condition. Philosophy is one of the branches in humanities. Mm-hmm. And especially concerned about our need for meaning.
Yep.
And so if you bypass that merely for pragmatic ends, it's disastrous for your own soul, your own pursuit of meaning.
Yeah, it's disastrous for human agency. I mean, look, if you think only in terms of pragmatic or prudential outcomes, then trust me, you already, every one of you have in their pockets an instrument that is much better than you in figuring these things out. Much faster. Computers, robots. So if you begin viewing yourself only or engaging in this form of instrumental thinking, then you basically offer yourself to be replaced by a robot who will do it better than you. And then what is left?
But it's also, I think, it has assumptions built in. Let me call them presuppositions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that
So-
reminds me of something.
Oh, yeah? Good.
Oh, yeah, I know.
All right. So assumptions or presuppositions, when we have certain pragmatic ends, we make assumptions about what goals we should pursue, what will make me happy, how things work. So what's happening usually is we have kind of a thin layer of beliefs about pragmatic ends supported by a number of beliefs which we haven't really critically thought about. And that's really what philosophy and that process of philosophy does, is it brings those to our awareness. So it's a kind of growth of consciousness or awareness about the things that we're presupposing. And that's one of the suggestions I like to make, is that we have to approach problems in civil discourse that way, which is if we start with a problem that has 10 assumptions that are controversial assumptions that we don't all agree on, we're never going to solve that problem unless we step back and deal with the more previous ones.
Right.
And so that's why that's what I mean when I say rational presuppositionalism is, look, if we want to debate abortion, there are 10 layers at least of assumptions about what a human is and what the goal of human life is that we'd have to get into first. And so going at it about abortion will elicit a lot of emotional reactions, but probably won't actually come to agreement because we're not even addressing the assumptions we have in a different.
That's possible, but I want to go back to this idea because I think that I think it's very important in our culture today that we are very good at instrumental reasoning. We are very good at creating artifacts that are good at instrumental in technology and creating things. And if we allow this to dominate ourselves and who we are, then we essentially cede to be replaced by the very things we make. Period.
We're no longer.
Period. Because, and by replace, I don't necessarily mean the Matrix or something like that. I mean, we devalue ourselves. So we basically say we are no more valuable or important than a machine.
iPhone.
So then we shouldn't be surprised if this is how we are treated.
Well,
Shouldn't be surprised about that. Now here's the deal though. We have to actually engage in the non-instrumental or inherent value and ways of thinking, even if that is very hard. And so that's I think we agree on that.
Oh yeah, I think that's right. So that what we're doing then is sort of replacing our humanity, or we're zeroing in on a very limited scope of it, which, as you say, the computers are better at, but also a lot of animals are better at.
Absolutely.
I couldn't fly from Canada to Mexico each year round trip just by flapping my arms, but geese do this, right? So there's animals that solve problems that we don't solve very well. So yeah, we have to tap in, and I think that's what philosophy especially is getting at in the need for meaning. That if we're doing this, it's not something that could be replaced by other things.
Right.
You can read great books on your iPhone, but you can't have your iPhone searching for meaning in the same way. So I think that is right. That's essential to it, and
I think that this is one of the dangers of our culture is right now at this crossroads. It either goes one way or it takes another road. And if it goes one way, then we'll find ourselves in 25, 50 years, and I'll still be around because I'm 730 years old, so I'll still be around then. Basically functionally equivalent to any machine. So
well, I mean, that's how we have a lot of dystopias about that, right?
Yeah.
So Brave New World or
Yeah.
1984 in general, where you can reach a point in society where you can be provided with pleasure, Soma, Brave New World, and the government can provide this with you, and you can kind of just have a blissed out life. But at the same time, as we read this, we're seeing that this is not really a human life anymore. Something's been lost.
that's right.
So that there's more to life than seeking pleasure.
And that's why I'm emphasizing this, because I think that this is very dangerous, particularly in the younger generations, but also older ones. But just now, with people who were born with computers and cell phones, it's so easy to immerse yourself into that and think this is it.
Well, and imagine too, that's why I brought up at the beginning, how most of the discourses we see are not resolved.
No.
And they're very acrimonious, and they don't go anywhere. And so if your main outlet is looking at some social media where people argue and never get anywhere, you'll be all the more inclined to say, what's the point of having discussions, right? It doesn't get anywhere, it doesn't do anything. Philosophers haven't. They've had a long track record of, I mentioned American pragmatists have only given us more divisions, but they could be said of philosophy in general. It's not as if philosophers have been solving problems left and right, and that's one of the reasons why technologists do make progress, because at least they do give us things. What has the philosopher done for us lately?
But here's the thing to watch. Every movement in philosophy had in it the goal to end all of philosophy. Every movement. Oh, we're gonna give answers, we're gonna show either all the questions are meaningless, and then those that are meaningful we're gonna be in this box or that box and done. Every movement had the same thing in common, and every movement failed.
But I wonder.
Joe, one second. I failed in ending philosophy because ending philosophy means ending the questions. And that, I believe, will never happen. And I'm so happy that it will never happen.
Yeah, I think a couple things about that. One is that it would be impossible to end the questions. And I think you're right that there's people who think that way, but the idea that somehow you can be done in knowing, as opposed to knowledge is inexhaustible. I mean, there's more things to learn about our own fingernails, let alone any other question. But I don't think that translates into, and many people make the step, therefore we know nothing.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think that follows. I think we can know some things, we know some little things, we build up other things, we build up other things. And even though in one sense you might say, well, it's always revisable, it might turn out that we built a tower on the sand and we have to go back and start over. Again, there are some things I think that aren't revisable, right? Like A is A. Let's not turn out, it turns out A is non-A. So there's some things that we know, and we build on those. But you're right, this would continue on, otherwise it would be boring. And I think there was a comment, you and I were in a discussion with some others on Facebook about the afterlife.
Yes.
And there's this view like that of the afterlife, which is basically when you die, you get satisfaction, and you're done. And you're commenting how boring that would be.
My concern about, people, sometimes I ask, whether you believe there is an afterlife or not, how many hope there is. And most people hope that there is an afterlife. But that's what the discussion was. I kind of would like to know more before I hope for it.
Yeah.
Because what if it's like a permanent sort of same state and nothing new happens?
Well, that was the question I raised, which is, people will say, this world stinks, at least there's a next life.
Yes.
And I said, well, what if it's more like what Hamlet considered, which is it gets much worse for us, right? So maybe this world stinks and the next one's even worse. Mm-hmm. There's no guarantee that it would somehow be better out of this. So we'd have to work through, just the mere idea of the afterlife doesn't give us any promise at all.
I sometimes do a bet with my students. I say, okay, here's a bet. I can give you afterlife because obviously I am, and I can bestow upon you afterlife on one condition. Choose one video game only, no, upgrades or anything, just one video game, and that is it, what you're gonna do forever. That video game, that's it. Any takers? No, I think nobody seriously took the bet.
Yeah.
So
one book or even if you got 100, we're
Doesn't
talking about
matter.
indefinite.
Yeah, people have to, there is a little bit of understanding of what is infinity and what is afterlife as an infinite realm is. No matter how big a number that you pick, I don't care how big a number it is, other than infinity, there's still infinite amount left.
A billion games, a bit more.
It doesn't matter. I give you a billion games, play it for each a billion years, infinite amount of more time.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to really, and this is where it's important to ask the questions, what do we mean when we talk about afterlife?
I think that's right. That's really what philosophy does as the first question. Not, are you right or wrong?
Yes.
But what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by
So
that?
that comes up with afterlife, but it comes up with God.
Yep.
People will say either I can prove God exists or I can disprove God exists, but what I find in the conversation is they don't even agree on what the term means.
Yep.
So what do you mean by God? What do you mean by knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned progress in philosophy, and I've been a little bit harsh on philosophy. But I think you did give a hint in some ways where we can say philosophy has made progress, specifically in a negative way of ruling some things out. So there's been philosophy, and we've gone down some dead ends, and we're able to say, oh, that was a dead end. That is a kind of progress. It's not the same as the progress they might make in engineering.
Right.
But it is a certain kind of progress, which is good for philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And I think philosophy is one of those fields where we maximally, in my opinion, we maximally exemplify what is one of the unique characteristics of being human, which is reflection.
Yeah.
It's reflection. It's inherently reflective. And so I believe that we are, as so far as we know, unique insofar as we are able to reflect, on our thoughts, our values, our preferences, our beliefs, about the world.
Usually when you have sci-fi like 2000, Space Odyssey 2001, that's the moment they show consciousness is when it can begin to say, hey, why am I doing this?
Yep.
But even then, there is reflection, which I think you're probably right about, but then there's also thought, which is also a little bit different, because it's not as if there's thought and then there's thinking about thought. I'm putting that in its own category, thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go meta levels forever, thinking about thought, about thinking about thought, about thinking about thought. So it's not just achieving awareness, but actually thinking. Now I know with computers, it's one thing because they do the language that we program them, so they might appear to think in one way, whereas with animals it's a little different. But philosophy doing this thinking, and especially getting at what I call these logically basic questions. So even in society where you have people, you're mentioning the ills of pragmatic outcome thinking. Even that, though, has these presuppositions in place, and people just aren't aware of them.
Right.
And so part of what you and I have to do is simply get people to grow in a consciousness of their own assumptions in order to be able to do that self-awareness, be able to critique themselves.
And this is where it's important. You mentioned something before about thinking. We have to be very careful because sometimes all we mean by thinking is whatever causes this behavior. So you have something is going on in this animal and that causes this behavior, and we just call it thinking because we think, why did you do this? Well, I thought that this is how it's going on, so that's why I did it. And the computer, it thinks that I said this, but something causes a certain behavior or overt behavior that we're going to observe.
It's a kind of reductionism. It's called behaviorism.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's very often the word thinking is simply a placeholder for whatever causes the behavior.
Yeah, right.
But we got to be careful because not all causes are the same. And that's where people get confused when they say, well, computers think because after all, what we say thinks that this is happening.
Right. So usually, like in philosophy class, we're usually speaking about beliefs.
Yes.
So we're putting concepts together into a belief or judgment. We say that pen is gray. And we have some belief about if that's true or false, and that's where you're not able to follow up with your pet Fido, right? You say beer me, and he gets the beer, brings it to you, but you're not able to follow up with, you have beliefs, Fido, about this. And it's Sesties, why did you do this? Or Polly says, I want a cracker. Yes, but Polly, why do you want a cracker, right? Follow up on these with this, and is it true or false?
And by the way, I should mention that now that you link the beliefs to a false thinking and to a false, I should just throw it out because we may not get to this today, obviously. I myself believe that free will begins with our ability to examine the truth and falsity of our beliefs. That's where free will begins. Any being that is incapable of evaluating their beliefs with respect to truth and falsity is not going to be free. So that's just throwing it out because that's a relationship. So it doesn't matter what is the source of your belief.
Yeah, right.
What's the origin of the belief?
So in other words, this could be a kind of compatibilism.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing. I call that rational freedom, which is we're free to use reason if we want to. And the origin of it or the prior cause.
It doesn't make any difference what It's fine if you got the belief because your family had the belief. It's fine because, a brick fell on your head and suddenly it pops out. But if you are incapable of examining it and asking, is it true or false? Then to that extent you're not free. So it's kind of a precondition of the whole idea of an agent that is free agent.
It's in contrast for everyone that freedom means the ability to do otherwise. So that view of freedom says you're only free if you weren't caused to do what you did. And so it's called counter-causal freedom, and then there's a whole bunch of ways where they try to put in that uncaused event, right? Because they want to hide it. They don't want to say that's an uncaused event, so they'll bring it in over here or over here.
My slogan is, to be free is to be able to think otherwise.
Yeah, you can bring in that. Or if it's basically coming back to doing, freedom means you have a free will.
Yeah.
So you're free to do what you want. And so that's irrespective of your causes. This is what I want to do, and nothing's restraining me. So if I'm tied down, I'm no longer free, and I can't do what I want. I wanted to leave. That's what matters to me. If I am able to get up and leave when I want to, but then you told me, oh, you only did that because of the niacin in your lunch.
Right.
Well, I don't care. I still got to do what I want.
Yeah.
Right? That's what matters to me. So that's just some of the debate background behind free will. And it would have been more interesting if we disagreed. If I was a libertarian and you were compatibilist, but you were both compatibilists.
So wait, man.
Yeah, please.
So you're saying that you agree that we live in free will, or that we don't?
Yeah, we both agree you have free will, and we both agree that free will is compatible with causation. You can have both cause, be pre-caused, predetermined, elect, bring in theology, and free.
So may I ask another of
Yeah, please.
here? Okay, are you familiar with the book Catch 22?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So would you agree that people who are in the army, right, do you think that they live at free will?
Well, it's interesting. So when Peter was mentioning freedom at the level of thinking, I said, yeah, I talk about that. I call that rational freedom. And we have different levels, areas in which we're free, right? So for example, I'm not free to break the laws of physics.
Right.
Even if I want to, it doesn't happen. So that's kind of a practical freedom I don't have. So then in my job, could be the military or it could be at ASU. There's rules, and I'm not free to break those rules without losing my job.
Right.
So that's different though. Well, what I think we're talking about is a kind of freedom you can't lose. You always have this freedom.
You can always, as long as your mind works all right and you're conscious, you are able, at least the way I look at it, to ask, is this belief of mine true? And you can have a debate with yourself. You can say, well, wait a minute, I got it from my family, the family got it from their family, and so forth. And you can say, yeah, but is it still true? As long as you can do that, I maintain that is sort of like the first precondition of freedom.
And one of the most famous books, or a very influential book in philosophy, is called The Consolation of Philosophy, written by Boethius, and he was in prison. And that's what he's finding is the consolation of philosophy, is you can still do these things. And in fact, these might be the most important things to do, so that when you're put in prison, it kind of focuses your attention in a way where you get your focus only on the most important things, and not be sidetracked with Facebook and classes. No, classes are important. Don't skip classes.
Don't skip classes, yeah.
Now,
Take them.
Now let's talk about something you and I have talked about this a little bit before in person and on Facebook. And it's one of these things of questioning, has philosophy made progress on this? Of all things. Have we made progress in agreeing there's no being from non-being?
So that the being and non-being are two separate categories.
Yeah. I think they're the most fundamental difference you can have. Not just like two of the separate ones, but that's the most basic difference of anything. And I'm trying to think of any philosophy.
By non-being, you mean something that doesn't exist?
Yeah, non-existence, not real, not being. So it doesn't mean an idea, it doesn't mean a spirit, like not a physical thing, a spirit.
Non-being is like totally non-existent.
Yeah, it's real nothing. Whereas some people say the universe from nothing, and you look into it and it turns out nothing means quantum foam, which is still something.
Right.
That's being from being.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you have material being from God, who's non-material,
Right.
that's still being from being. Being from non-being would be what we really mean by nothing. So there's a problem already that there could be nothing. And then that makes being. That seems to be something philosophers.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that we take serious the concept of nothing, and so I agree that if you have sprinkles of whatever it is, then that's something. So to that extent, yeah, absolutely, there's
Because the reason I bring that up is both since we've talked about it, but also because that seems to be one of the central questions and disagreements in the history of philosophy. Is this: there's an agreement that something is eternal, without beginning, because you don't have being from non-being. What is it? And that seems to be one of the main dividing lines between philosophy, right? So it's not just atheist and theist. There are also the Platonic and Aristotelian dualists who would say both matter and the forms are eternal. There are spiritual monists, philosophical Hinduism, which would say all is one and it's mind. Then there's theists / deists, right, who say God alone is eternal and the world is made by God. And then atheists who could maybe have different formulations, some form of materialism. Matter's always been there, the universe in some form has always been there. But that really seems to be the debate in philosophy, as opposed to there's not really some view out there where someone maintains there was once non-being and there is. The closest you might get is Buddhism, but even that doesn't. It might say every individual thing is momentary, but the series has always been there. So nothing is eternal, no individual thing. There's no substance, it denies substance. But there's a series of moments from eternity. So there's really not a view that says there is being or not being. That seems to me non-contentious, and yet it's another thing where just like people argue about if A is A, people will say, well, maybe there's, for all you know, on the dark side of the moon, there's non-being that's spouting out being left and right.
Right. So one of the, like for example, I would assume that, let's say, if there are abstract objects, and by abstract objects we mean objects that are outside of space and time, those would be beings.
Yeah, that counts in this case. Or so
numbers,
Plato's,
for example,
right.
if you have a Platonist view about mathematics and there are numbers out there that would count as being.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one argument that people advance is that you can't have those without a mind. So they would say that's proof for God's existence. Abstract ideas are proof that God exists. That's an argument that some people show. But the idea is the same.
You can make. I myself, believe that there is a transcendent reality in the sense that there are objects out there that are not in time and space. One of them could be God, but certainly there are numbers, propositions that I believe exist quite independently of our minds at least.
Yeah, so it's probably a form of Platonism.
Yeah.
Which is important to say. We say God could be one of them. A lot of times theists will rely on either Plato or maybe especially Aristotle to give proofs for God, when what Aristotle at best is doing and Plato is saying something like what you just said. There's what is called the demiurge, who is one of these eternal beings, but the demiurge is not the creator of the heavens and the earth. These things also existed from eternity. They're sort of like a chunk of clay that's always existed, and the demiurge can form this into the visible world. But that's as far from theism as materialism is. They're both equally far, logically.
Yeah, I think Aristotle's argument, the cosmological argument, Aristotle's sort of original cosmological argument, which he really didn't put it for the existence of God. He just wanted to prove that the universe had to have a beginning, that there can be actually infinity. That was the point. Then theists borrow that argument to show that if there is a beginning, then there has to be a cause.
And at the beginning is say, personal God. Personal creator.
Right.
Even then, I think the way Aquinas phrases it is that this argument shows that the world had a beginning, but this could have been from eternity. So what he says is we need scripture to know that the world was created a finite amount of time.
Yeah, this argument is very interesting. Van Morrison goes into this question because he says, look, if the universe had a beginning and there was nothing prior, including time, then that beginning could in principle be outside of space and time
Well, yeah.
And so that's in some sense forever. So the beginning is forever, the way we would describe it using temporal things. But
We couldn't say that, in other words, I think Aquinas, and Augustine work on this problem. You can't say before the beginning.
right,
However, it doesn't follow that the beginning happened an infinite amount of time ago either. So both those could be true.
right. But it depends what your view is about the beginning, whether the beginning includes time itself, or the beginning is just a particular point, event in time.
Yeah. So what we might do, so we're hoping to have these discussions, each semester. So what we might do is, as we're going along and we see, we made some progress on being from non-being, but I think now a good one for the future would be, is the eternal being personal?
Oh,
Because I think that's where you and I, that'd be a good disagreement.
very big discussion about that, because I am radically opposed to a personal God.
But here's what I think will happen.
I'm not opposed to monotheism, I'm not opposed to all kinds of other,
Yeah.
but I'm opposed to a personalized God.
So that's what I'm predicting, is we'll spend our time on what do you mean by that, which is what philosophy does.
Exactly.
Because as we enter into discussion, someone might initially say, well, how can you think that? And then you find out what Peter's talking about are things you also would disagree with, right? There's no guy who lives on Mount Olympus and dishes out arbitrary punishments, right? So you say, yeah, of course, that's not what I meant.
Exist.
Yeah, right?
Zeus doesn't exist.
So that'd be how we do it, right? How do we do this in philosophy? What does it mean for God to be personal? Because even for theism, there are questions, right? God is not personal in an equal way that we're personal, because God is eternal and we're not eternal. And so, or someone might want to raise that question and say we can go with open theism. So God is just like us and just a little bit bigger than us.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be a good one that we can say. Maybe we even make that the topic of the next time.
Right.
Because I want to also get to a third question. We've got a little bit about common ground, knowledge, metaphysics, being, but now value,
Right, oh yeah. Very
the good.
Yeah, I mean, you can have there's always a question whether, for example, even on a person like God conception, are we viewing God as a person like being along the lines of a super duper duper man kind of thing? So you take, let's say, omnipotence. So, I have some power, I can lift this, Owen is bigger, so he has more power, and somebody else is bigger and has more power and more power and more power. And then you think about God as kind of like, extend that to way, way out there. That can be one. Or this would be kind of like a quantitative conception. God is just simply more powerful than any being we know. But you can have a qualitative conception, and that would be no longer a longer continuum of power, but a whole different qualitative conception.
Yeah.
And that could still be a person like God.
Yeah, and I think that first one is what comes out in a lot of popular writing about God. So, for example, in the show Supernatural, there's a character named God, and he just happens to be a really super powerful being within this area, but it's conceivable there's some other areas where they come in and that guy could beat this God up.
Right.
And that's certainly not what classical theism says about God. So it takes some time to figure out what is meant by the term God and personal. What would it mean to be an eternal person?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if largely what might happen is that we begin to think about this empirically, and you're suggesting we might project. So I agree with Feuerbach, who said, if you want to know a man's God, get to know the man.
Mm-hmm.
So gods are usually just a projection of our own
That's what I call avatar in our last day.
Yeah. And that seems absolutely to be the case psychologically. That's what people do. And that's the very source of idolatry, is likening God. God is just basically, he's like me, only a little stronger, although I'm pretty strong. So that it's iffy on that one. Right? But so we have these idols. So classical theism will be right with you on that. It's saying, we need to dispel, get rid of our idols, and not approaching it empirically, right? So there's no way we could know from first-hand experience what it's like to be an eternal person.
Not from first hand, yeah.
No. And even being told that in time on in a lecture or something. So there's a kind of aseity to God, otherness to God, where if we're going to know God, it would have to be because God reveals himself to us. Now that normally means in Scripture, but it could also be in God's works of
But in
creation.
Scripture, you have a problem with Scripture because, as we know, in Scripture you have also God walking around, and God getting angry, and then God getting happy.
All right, so that's another good one. We'll come back to those and see.
Yeah.
Because you and I probably disagree about those, but what I was mentioning Scripture for was, what I'm suggesting is not merely Scripture. I'm also talking about natural theology or general revelation, which is that
general revelation.
In all of God's works of creation and providence, something's revealed about God. So I suspect you and I agree about a number of the mistaken views of the divine person.
Right. There is something I would like to just add here, because I know you are.
Go ahead. Yeah.
You are okay? Okay, good. Okay. You know, many people on both sides have a mistaken conception about what should be our view of religion and how should we approach it. Some view on one side think that it's all some sort of like a fables, stories, doesn't mean much. And then you have the other side who think that literal interpretation, every word, who, and then who, what does the word mean? It's what they told me in the church or in the synagogue or whatever. And actually I believe that we should view this whole territory as a theory about this transcendent reality. And we should and then there's a problem, of course, what are the rules of this theory? But that's how we should view it. And I think then it becomes much more, first of all, much more interesting.
Well, what happens is you have these antinomies. You name a common antinomy which comes up, and that is, on the one hand, religion is just a bunch of outdated myths that we've outgrown. On the other hand, literalism, as you said, every word has one meaning alone, and then you get into some significant contradictions in the text.
Right.
And so these fuel each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I mentioned earlier what I call rational presuppositionalism, which is that when we end up in one of these antinomies, we notice that they have assumptions. And we have to step back and look at what those are. What assumptions got us to this point of that antinomy? And I encountered this way as well in class. I encounter students coming in who are what I call pre-skeptics, which means they think they know and they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they get questioned, they become skeptics. Now they say, I don't know, and no one else can ever know anything.
Right.
And so I find these two antinomies operating, pre-skeptic and skeptic, and I think the goal in philosophy is to become a post-skeptic. That never means you know everything, because this is impossible. But it means you do know some basic things, and you start from there and you move on to other things. So I think we encounter antinomies like that often in life, and religion is one of them. But so let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about religion and the text, is there any need for redemption?
You really want to go there?
You got 30 seconds. No, I'm just joking. Well, here's what I mean. Religion's not just say like there's baseball, there's business, there's psychology, there's religion, there's other things. There's also this claim being made in some religions that humans need redemption. It's more than just more information.
Redemption for what?
From sin.
I knew we were going to get there.
Yeah, and I knew, you and I had talked about this before, so that's why I want to bring this up. I don't mean, say, original sin. Just the idea of sin. Is there such a thing as sin? And is there such a thing as the need for being redeemed from sin?
Yeah, I'm assuming that there are things that are terrible human actions, and you can call them sin and so forth.
Now, maybe that's a theology term, so it might be low. You might say, I don't want to bring that in. It's not like moral evil.
Yeah, the reason why I'm saying that is because when you talk about sin, to me, it immediately relates to original sin. And you know my view about that.
I don't mean that at all.
Moral wrongdoing, absolutely. But how we sort of, as you say, redeem ourselves from if we commit a moral wrongdoing, and we all do.
Well, I'm not sure I have.
I know you did.
One time I thought I did, but I was wrong.
Yeah, you were wrong about that. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But it's interesting when you said, how do we redeem ourselves? That's part of the question.
Right.
Can we redeem ourselves, or is this something that would have to be done for us?
Yes, we can. Of course, I wouldn't mind help,
Yeah.
but I think that we can. We can do a lot to redeem ourselves. Here is where we get into the questions of value here. If we do a moral wrongdoing, there is one conception in which we have really did something to the world. We increased evil in the world. And that has to be remedied. And now, can one person, with the limitations that we have and all of that, could we actually bring it into equilibrium again? That is a huge question, and I think many people think that this is actually what happens. And that's why punishment is so important, because that could be in part bringing it back to
Yeah.
equilibrium.
So it could
Or
be-
maybe it's only God can do it. Or what in Christian theology is called the grace of God. Without the grace of God, you can't do it.
Well, I think what helps though maybe is to get back to what is it that needs redemption.
Mhm.
So, for example, let's say I'm not using reason. No amount of arguing with me, you could argue with me all day about how I should use reason,
Mhm.
but part of listening to you requires I'm using reason to understand your points, right?
Right.
So if we're in a condition of alienation, not just from, say, some moral code, but from what we should know itself, then it doesn't seem to be a problem of either self-help or another person arguing me into it. It seems to be a problem of kind, right? I'm here and I need to be here, and that's where you use the word grace comes in the sense of an external thing you didn't deserve, you didn't earn.
Right.
So then you're talking about redemption, just getting the focus of what the problem is. What do you need, as we've been talking about in philosophy,
Right.
by redemption? Do you mean something like you were talking about balancing the scales, or do you mean something like, how do I go from being dead to being alive?
So the thing is that when you're talking about the issues about reason, that you don't. Rachel, see you later. I know. There, the thing is what you do to yourself, essentially. So usually when we talk about evil, moral wrongdoing is what we do to others. But what you, I think, when I'm talking about is what we do to ourselves.
Self, and interestingly this way, because oftentimes people start off with the idea of moral evil as some form of harm to the neighbor.
Yes.
You didn't love your neighbor as yourself. But that's the second law.
Mm-hmm.
The first law was to love the Lord your God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not always measurable in human experiential terms. Like, well, I stole. That's still loving your neighbor. So are there some duties that we have owed to God, let's say? The first one being to recognize there even is a God at all.
Mm-hmm.
And when we failed in those, it's as if we're dead in one sense. And I think that's common religious terminology, right? When Nicodemus talks to Jesus, he asks, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus says, you have to be born again. It's as if you're dead. So that's common. And it's been so used, it's misused, right? Are you born again? Are you born again? But that is a category. In other words, you don't give yourself birth the first time. Although I did just see in the news, a guy is suing his parents because he didn't ask to be born. This is brilliant. Why couldn't I have found this? And he wants recompense for all the existential suffering of existing. It's like, yeah, right. I should have thought of that. So I'm asking about redemption. It's in that sense, just like that first time when we laugh about that because you don't have a hand in your own first birth. Redemption seems to be not merely could include this idea of balancing, but the idea of there's something where I need this change to occur. And it's not something I need a human coach to just tell me how to do more push-ups, read more books. It would have to be divine.
Depends what you mean by divine.
Yeah. Say it aloud for them.
Depends what you mean by divine, of course,
Yeah,
because
philosophy.
for me, when Owen says divine, I know he means divine in the sense of a person like God. For me, divine doesn't mean that. For me, divine means we talk about it when.
Yeah, well, we'll do that.
Yeah.
That's a good cliffhanger because we'll do that, make that a special one.
Yeah.
Because even then, I would guess you and I probably agree 99% of the time on what personal God can't be.
Right.
Right. So there's just like the same with heaven
Yeah.
in that discussion.
Yeah.
There's so many misconceptions. It's almost most of the time in philosophy is spent clearing those out
Yes.
before we even able to get to where do we disagree. But that's why I would think part of what I was suggesting as common ground would simply be a commitment to doing that.
Yeah.
A commitment to saying, let's look at the assumptions or presuppositions involved to get back to where do we actually disagree, because maybe we don't. Maybe it's just a phantom disagreement, and it turns out we agree about the same problems. So that's part of what we do in philosophy as well. And beginning with that question of what meaning, what does this mean, or what is this actual dispute? Now let me ask you as well, if you have some questions for us. Yeah.
Question came up for me because I said,
Speak up.
Here, why don't you guys circulate
Yeah.
this? Because I think that
I guess I had like discussions with other people who completely deny the existence of a God or the concept of a God. So my question is, when people who completely deny the existence of a God or the idea of God and only accept the scientific studies or things that can only be explained through concepts, arguments, and things that we know of from research or experiences in our lives that are not on basis of things that are not eternal, should these people be so hasty to leave God, the concept of God, out of discussion when talking about things that aren't eternal?
Well, maybe what you're asking, because you mentioned using concepts and arguments, there could be, especially when we talk about religion, something that we might call mysticism, which is, it uses the word knowledge this way, knowledge by acquaintance. So the mystic would say, I've had a personal experience of the divine or whatever else, and that is how I know. And so Peter was mentioning before our ability to think about our thoughts. So what happens is, as soon as someone says, I had this experience and here's what it means, now they've left the mystical realm and they've entered the realm of rational dialogue. So then we can say, well, is that what it means? Are you sure that's what you experienced and how to interpret that experience? So in that sense, I think the way you set up the problem might be a kind of false antinomy of one or the other. Rational discourse would be impossible to avoid if you're dealing with beliefs.
Yeah, I understand that, but when people only kind of just accept one side of it, of just science, just pure science, they don't believe the idea of God. Is it right for them? Or I don't want to use right or wrong because it's a concept that everyone has a different version of. To just leave that idea out of the table and discuss about things that aren't eternal because we are not eternal.
Well, what do you mean by science? You mean like empirical studies?
Yeah, empirical studies.
That would seem to be a problem, yeah, because knowledge is not from experience. We get knowledge by interpreting our experiences. So yeah, if we had to know what's eternal based on experience, we never would know. But what do you want to ask?
yeah, you have to distinguish between sort of, there are some people who, hold science in very high esteem, and for good reason. It gave us huge amount of knowledge. But at the same time, do not deny that there may be other forms of knowledge or other routes to expand our knowledge. And so that's one way, and that will be consistent with, I think, both of what we hold. But then there are those which sometimes are called scientism, which says the only knowledge possible is whatever science is, and then you have to specify which science, and so forth. And that is much more controversial.
That's usually following from the view that only matter exists. So they start with that assumption, and then they impose that on the rest of their experiences. But what's interesting, in the question, we kind of blur very easily science. And so we'll refer to science as technology that gives us things like this or medical breakthroughs. But then we also let philosophical materialists tag on and say, oh, I'm just doing science too, only matter exists. And say, no, wait a minute, that's two separate things, right? One is philosophical materialism, and one is technology, which could be perfectly consistent within theism.
So I usually distinguish between the metaphysical materialism, which is a metaphysical claim, only material stuff exists, and what I call the materialist research paradigm or scientific paradigm, which is sort of basically when it comes to physical events, look for physical causes, and that will give you a good directive. But that does not mean that if you don't find any, then that's it. That's the only knowledge there is. So you could say that the strategy that has been of the part of science so far has been a very good strategy to acquire knowledge of a certain kind, and yet at the same time not claim that this is the only knowledge. So, you know.
And that's what ends up tending towards the pragmatism that you were talking about at the beginning, which is because science has given me devices, it provides knowledge, but that kind of knowledge is not really the same as meaning.
Yeah.
And that's where you get into a number of these dystopias. In something like Brave New World, they have technology, and life is happy at one level that drugs can provide, but it's not meaningful.
Right. Basically, we should not equate useful with food.
Yeah, right. Over here, you want to use microphone or yell?
I can yell if you need me to. So thank you for this dialogue that Kamala provided. Thank you.
Hi.
All right.
So my question concerns more the nature and inevitable product of dialogue that is disagreement. It seems like when we at least concede that there are laws of thought or logic and inference, someone's going to say A, the other one's going to say non-A. And my question is, what are some, if any, what are some possible fruits that can come from navigating disagreement? Because it's one thing to have a dialogue where we all just affirm everything together, but what are some fruits of the conflict of A and non-A? What's the value of dialectic?
Good, yeah, I think we saw that today. So when I began, I said we agree on some things and disagree on other things. And I think in our society, we don't have healthy models of disagreeing, right? So disagreeing is generally makes us uncomfortable, and we don't do it. And so that's one thing we wanted to model, and I think we've given you some examples. We did agree on some things, like the laws of thought, and there's no being from non-being. But we also disagreed, and in one way, pushed those into the future. In our next topic, here's why that's not just IOU. I think that's actually helpful in this way, where we're able to say, well, we disagree, we're going to talk about the future, and it doesn't destroy our relationship or leave us in tension, right?
Right.
So we're able to say, no, we're going to do that, and we'll talk about that still, and we have every hope of reaching agreement about those as well. But so tension or disagreement doesn't of itself have to end a relationship or friendship.
And here it's very important. Because of these kind of things, because we don't know that the art of debate has been squeezed out of our society, we don't really, as a society, have a good attitude towards what a healthy debate is. And there are psychological reasons for that. I'll give you an example, okay? So this is a lighter. Give me a hand. What are you going to do if I start that here?
Probably worried that my little hairs are going to catch on fire.
Right. But what is the instinctive thing to do?
Retract it?
Do it. And that's because skin is a protector of our insides. Our beliefs and values are the protector of our mental life. And so debate very frequently is viewed as fire. And we actually have to learn how to overcome that fear.
Yeah, we have an identity with we self-identify with certain beliefs as opposed to with the ability to use reason.
Yes.
And then when those beliefs are challenged, then that's a challenge to our identity and involves us in fight. So that's one reason why we wanted to do this today, was to give an example of dialectic. Now, what I proposed, and we seem to make progress on this today, is that when we do encounter what seems to be an insurmountable disagreement, and I bet we could easily go around the room and name the cultural ones that we are familiar with, that's because we're not identifying presuppositions. And so we're getting stuck there. We need to learn also that art of learning to think backwards, so to speak. Work backwards logically. And we've given some examples of doing that today as well. So that's why I said I have hope in that process that when we do come back together and talk about, say, what it means for God to be a person, that we would still be able to make progress in that. And just simply by beginning with that question, what do you mean?
Yeah.
We make progress. But I think you're right that we don't have very many examples of that. And that's one reason why we want to set this up and do it more than once. This will be a semesterly thing, because we don't get a lot of examples of having these kinds of discussions about these kinds of basic questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe, sorry, one example of a question is about being from non-being. I think you guys, was that mentioned today? I can't remember. Being from non-being seems to be an example of the kind of thing you guys talked about where it's often not spoken of in terms of the meaning of it. You hear, oh, being from non-being. For instance, I was in a class one time where I learned about a Chinese guy who said being comes from non-being. And it turned out that he meant the Tao, that being comes from the Tao. Not really non-being.
Yeah.
So I wonder from both of you, if it's specified what being from non-being means, is there any sense in which it could happen?
Yeah, I think
Possible.
maybe you had to step out because we covered that exact point. And we went through a number of things that non-being isn't. It's not gravity, it's not quantum foam, it's not empty space, it's nothing.
It's
And
not
how
negative.
So when that's specified, when you get down to the meaning of absolutely nothing, then
That's nothing.
pulled out.
It-
Yeah, we agreed
it's
there's
like-
no being from non-being. The real debate that's left is what is eternal?
Yeah.
So did you guys get to where you disagree about what is eternal?
Yeah, somewhat. Abstract ideas, transcendent abstract ideas, but not personal, and God is a person spirit. So we're going to come back and do that. We set it up for our next one. It's basically a cliffhanger on purpose to get you back.
We
And if you need one.
we disagree on one thing about the process. Owen, Professor Anderson, because he's very busy, he wants to do it once a semester. I would like to do it twice.
Okay, I'm fine with that too.
But I wonder, what do you think?
You'll be back?
Would people
All
come
right.
back if it's twice a
Okay.
semester?
We're going to work on a schedule.
We'll work on
And it'll probably be April, but we'll see.
Yeah,
And then we'll do another one.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to this. We have a question about sin and redemption, and a question on what is eternal.
Yeah.
But there'll be
Person like
more.
Value.
And we didn't get to that. I brought it up.
Yeah.
We didn't really get to what is good.
Yeah.
I think we have another question here.
Well, we might have to do it this way. After we're done, any of you can feel free to ask questions. I unfortunately need to leave a certain strict timing. But just to conclude this portion of it though, thank you everyone for being here. Again, this is Philosophy Out West 2019, our first, and I think what will be many examples of philosophical dialogue. What is rational discourse? So we covered a number of topics today: knowledge, well actually necessary preconditions for rational discourse, knowledge, what is eternal, and
Common ground.
common ground, yeah. And examples of the value of philosophy. And of course, the main reason why we want you to know the value of philosophy is for job security. We want you to write to your school and say, we need to keep these philosophers around. But also because it's we both agree it's very valuable. And
It is
important for
actually,
life.
to me, is saving civilization.
Yeah, I think
That's the way I really look at it.
Yeah. The need
But-
for meaning. Without meaning, there is no purpose to save civilization. So thank you again, and feel free to stay and ask questions. And if you want to ask me one as well, please email me. Owen Anderson, easy to find on ASU's website. Just email me, or I'll be happy to be in touch. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.